Good evening and welcome to In the Rabbi Study. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein and this is Valley Beth Shalom live and online. And this evening, our guest is Professor Erwin Chemerinsky, the Dean of the Law School at UC Berkeley. Erwin, welcome. It's an honor to have you here.
My honor and great pleasure to talk with you.
Good. I really appreciate your coming on because in the midst of all of the unrest, the demonstrations, and the upheaval that we're witnessing outside, there's some serious questions about the law, about civil liberties and civil rights, and about the future of American democracy. And I think of no one who's deeper invested in this and wiser than you. So let's begin with the obvious question. The demonstrations have as their message an end to systemic racism, particularly when it comes to law enforcement, incarceration. When we move from the rage of demonstration to the deliberation about how we actually change the society, what has to happen? What do the focuses have to be?
I think it's important that the protesters are saying we need to lessen the funding of police and of prisons. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. Those who are incarcerated are often disproportionately individuals of color. And this is a message that's being communicated that has to be heard. We also need to think about the ways in which the law is keeping us from having adequate reforms of the police department. The Supreme Court, now almost 40 years ago, said you can't sue a city or a police department for injunctions based on a single incidence of misconduct. It makes it very difficult when the police do something wrong to find somebody who's going to suffer that injury again. The Supreme Court has made it very difficult to sue cities when cities are leading to the violation of rights. Very difficult to sue individual officers. And so I think here there needs to be a reform of civil rights laws by Congress and a rethinking of some of these doctrines by the Supreme Court.
In South Africa, they used a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a way of venting the rage and the pain over systemic racism of apartheid and slowly bringing the parties together to the table. Do you think that sort of a process is necessary in America?
Yes, the death of George Floyd is just the most recent, even in relatively recent years, of unarmed African-American men being killed by police officers. And of course, racism in society and racism in law enforcement goes back to the earliest days of the United States. What we've seen in the country over the last week is rage. There needs to be a vehicle for it to be vented constructively and for it to lead to positive change. And so I think some kind of a national commission like that would be wonderful.
You sit at the top of one of the most important law schools in the country, training legal scholars, lawyers, judges for the next generation. As you work with these people and plant within them messages about their responsibility to the law, what has to happen now to bring some of this protest to a constructive result?
First, we have to educate ourselves as to the nature of the problem. And we have a responsibility within the law school to educate our students as well as our faculty and staff. For example, we're doing a program for our community on race and policing. Second, we need to pursue justice. We are an institution that's committed to justice. In fact, I have on the wall of my office in Hebrew and English, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. And so it's important that we provide opportunities for our students, staff, and faculty to be involved in a constructive way in doing things for reform to pursue justice.
You mentioned a moment ago about incarceration, and which is an astonishing set of statistics. I mean, the statistics that I read the other day is that you or I, as white males in America, have a 1 in 17 chance of ending up incarcerated at some point in our lives, but our black brothers and sisters, our black brothers, have a 1 in 5, or some people say a 1 in 3 chance of ending up incarcerated. It's an astonishing statistic. So part of that, of course, is social issues. Part of that is policing, but part of that is just how courts work and how the criminal justice system works. How does that have to be fixed?
You're right. It's about the whole criminal justice system. There have been studies that shown that if a white person and a black person are doing the same thing, the black person is more likely to get stopped by the police than the white person. If the white person and the black person are both stopped by the officer, the black individual is more likely to get arrested than the white individual. If the white individual and the black individual are both arrested, the black individual is likely to be charged with more serious crimes than the white individual. If the black individual and the white individual are both convicted of a crime, the black individual is much more likely to get a longer sentence or even a death sentence than the white individual. We have to confront that it's not coincidence. It's a result of systemic racism that has existed for hundreds of years.
And take that one more step. In addition to reforms that might make it easier to sue police, what could police chiefs, police commissions across the country, what directions do they need to take in order to create a more equal environment for Black and white Americans, Americans of color? How do they redress these grievances?
20 years ago, I was asked to do a study of the Los Angeles Police Department after the Rampart scandal. I worked with a group of civil rights lawyers, including Lori Levinson, who you and I know very well. And we produced a long report. And what we focused on was the culture of the Los Angeles Police Department. We said it was a culture that exalted Dirty Harry and shunned Serpico. We said that there was a need for many reforms. There needed to be a strengthening of civilian oversight of the police department. There needed to be an increase in mechanisms for people to file complaints that be taken seriously. There needed to be a meaningful disciplinary system for police. Now, I have to say that many of the reforms that we proposed were implemented as a result of the consent decree between Los Angeles Police Department and the United States Department of Justice. But we now know that they didn't go far enough, and more needs to be done for structural change within police departments to deal with these problems.
Let's turn for a moment to the protests themselves. Um, it's a remarkable phenomenon that for days and days, weeks now on end, thousands and thousands of Americans have stepped into the street to declare their affiliation with this movement and their resistance to systemic racism in the entire society. And it's, you know, at first there were evidences of incidents rather of vandalism, looting, violence, but now it seems to have become a peaceful movement. And much of the measures that were put in place to protect um, the shops and institutions from the violence have been removed, except for Washington, D.C., which seems to be a sort of fortress mentality. Um, Talk for a moment about the civil rights of protesters and where a democratic society draws a line between protecting, say, public officials, including the president, and allowing protests to go forward in order to express legitimate civil disobedience.
The core of the First Amendment is the right to engage in peaceful protest. The government can have what are called time, place, and manner restrictions. There's generally not a right to protest down the middle of the freeway at rush hour. That would be a legitimate time, place, and manner restriction. There's no right to engage in violence. There's no right to engage in looting or arson. But so long as people are peaceful and so long as they respect reasonable time, place, manner restrictions, there is the right to protest. And seeing people in cities across the country peacefully protesting, I hope will be a pressure for real reform.
Let's move for a moment away from this particular protest and look at a couple of other issues which I think are germane to your experience and expertise. Before all of this happened, before the tragic and horrible death of George Floyd, there were demonstrations in many state capitals against the various measures that were put in place to protect the population from the COVID virus. One in particular in Michigan, people with AR-15s with very large weapons came and blocked the state capitol. And they claimed that their constitutional rights had been abridged by these measures to stop the virus. Um, is there a case to be made for that, or is this something that's just, you know, is it a strange aberration of American rights?
It's a strange aberration of American right. Um, the government has the authority to stop the spread of communicable disease. This is clearly established. So the government can require that people be quarantined or shelter in place to stop the spread of communicable disease. The government requires that people be vaccinated. The government can order closure of businesses to stop the spread of communicable disease. And the government can also keep there from being large gatherings to stop the spread of communicable disease. In fact, just a week ago, the Supreme Court said that the governor could keep churches and synagogues and mosques from having large gatherings to stop the spread of communicable disease. Well, it also includes the government can stop protests where there's not social distancing. And that includes whether the protests are from the left or the right. And here the law is clear. So long as the government is acting reasonably for public health, its measures are going to be allowed.
I think one of the issues regarding the Constitution um, that worries people the most, and people, by the way, both on left and right, is what happens in November. We're scheduled for a very, very important and no doubt emotional election season. There's a presidential election that I can't remember one that's as fraught as this one. There'll be all the seats in the House of Representatives, a third of the Congress, and a great number of state state offices that are going to be open for election. And people are afraid of what happens. I mean, can a president for either legitimate or illegitimate reasons cancel an election? Can an election be decertified? Can it be brought into question and undermined? What's going to happen in November, Erwin?
Let me start with what's clear and then identify what's unclear. The Constitution says that a president's term ends at noon on January 20th. This term of Donald Trump will end at noon on January 20th. The president has no authority to cancel the election. There's no clause in the Constitution that permits it. If for some reason the election could not be held and no president or vice president selected, then on January 20th, the Speaker of the House of Representatives would become the President of the United States. In all likelihood, Nancy Pelosi would be the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and that's certainly a disincentive for anyone to try to cancel the election. Now, the time of the election is not set by the Constitution. The time of the election is set by federal statute. Early in American history, the election occurred at different times in various states. Since 1845, it's always been the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. This year, it's November 3rd. In theory, Congress could change that date so long as it produced a new president by January 20th. The Electoral College will meet in December on a specified date to choose the president. The president has no authority to change any of that. Now, to go to your specific question, might there be a dispute as to who won in a particular state, like there was in 2000 between Bush and Gore? Yes, and that issue could go to the Supreme Court, and that could decide the election, as it did in 2000. Now, many have said to me, what happens if Donald Trump loses in the Electoral College but refuses to leave office? My hope would be then that the courts would say, under the Constitution, he has to leave office, that I don't believe he would be able to, and I hope he could not control the military to stay in office. But if he lost in the Electoral College and somehow disobeyed that and stayed in office, that's the end of our constitutional democracy. We've seen it happen in other countries. I hope with all my heart it would never happen in this country.
What if he makes the case, and forgive me for conspiratorial thinking, but just what if he made the case that the election is illegitimate, that illegal voters voted, that mail-in ballots were miscounted, that states had swung it? Is it possible under the 12th Amendment to swing this into the House of Representatives for a different kind of an election and undermine the entire electoral process? Or is that simply conspiracy thinking on the left or the right?
With only two candidates, one seems certain to get a majority in the Electoral College. Only if no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College, which would be possible if there were 3 or 4 candidates, would you then see it go to the House of Representatives. Now, Donald Trump saying that the election is illegitimate because of voter fraud won't have any legal consequences unless he can convince the courts to change outcomes in particular states, and that then affects the Electoral College. Here's my fear. What if the Electoral College chooses Joe Biden and says that he got the necessary votes in the states to become president? How does Donald Trump then rile up his followers? And what do they do if he claims that it's an illegitimate election? I think the result then isn't to keep Joe Biden from being president, but to have a very different kind of wave of civil unrest than we've ever seen in this country.
Well, that's reassuring, I suppose, to
Well,
some
I
extent.
hope it doesn't happen. I mean, my hope is that Donald Trump, like every president since 1787, will honor the results in the Electoral College. And no president, even in very closely contested elections, has ever tried to stay in office after the Electoral College gives the election to somebody else. In 1800, the incumbent president, John Adams, lost in a very closely contested election that did go to the House of Representatives. Thomas Jefferson was chosen there. This was the first time in American history that an incumbent president lost re-election. But Adams left office. He didn't try to stay in power. We've seen too often across the world where those in power refuse to relinquish the reins of power. I hope it'll never happen in this country and not happen this November.
I'm simply tempted to quote our friend Lloyd Benson and say, I knew John Adams, I served with John Adams. Donald Trump is no John Adams.
Fair enough.
I know that you're a very, very sophisticated scholar of the court. So let's talk about the court for just a moment, because it's a remarkable reflection of this political moment and the social moment in our culture, in American history. We have a split court. Now with the election of these new justices of Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, we have a conservative majority on the court. We have Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Everyone on the left is praying that she lives to be 150 years old. The question, and then, but we've seen in the last couple of years that Chief Justice Roberts has taken a very interesting position of defending the integrity of the court, and sometimes siding with the liberals on these decisions. So as you read the court, tell us something about what the personality of this court's going to be.
It's 5 very conservative justices: Roberts, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. It's 4 justices that range from liberal to moderate liberal in Ginsburg, Breyer, Sonora, and Kagan. And I fear that in the most important cases, it's going to come down 5-4, split along those lines. It's also different than any court in American history in that the 5 conservatives were all appointed by Republican presidents, and the 4 liberals were appointed by Democratic presidents. Until recently, that wasn't the case. We had John Paul Stevens, a Republican appointee, who was one of those liberal justices. We had Harry Blackmun, a Republican appointee, who was one of the liberal justices. We had Byron White, and before that, Felix Frankfurter, Democratic appointees who were conservative. Never before has the ideology of the justices perfectly corresponded to the political party of the appointing president. That really heightens the perception of the politicization of the court. John Roberts is now the median justice. He's the swing justice. He's much more conservative than the prior swing justice, Anthony Kennedy. But Kennedy was more conservative than the swing justice before him, Sandra Day O'Connor. And she was more conservative than the swing justice before her, Lewis Powell. That reflects the court becoming much more conservative over, say, the last 40 years. That said, there's at least in some instances the indication that John Roberts will side with the liberals. 8 years ago, he joined with the 4 liberal justices to uphold Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And just a little over a week ago, he joined with the 4 liberal justices to allow the governor of California to impose restrictions on the size of assemblies for religious purposes. And so I think that's an indication that while Roberts is going to remain very conservative, there are at least some instances where his vote will be in play.
So help us understand him for just a moment. You sit in the chair of Chief Justice of the United States of America, the chair where John Marshall sat, the chair where Charles Evans. I mean, some of the great jurists of our history have sat. Um,
Earl Warren.
Earl Warren, right? Um, and he sees himself, at least what I've read is he sees himself responsible not simply for this decision or that decision, but for something called the integrity of the court and certainly the integrity of the process. How much does that weigh on him as he makes these decisions?
I think it weighs on him greatly. I think he is an institutionalist. I also think he has what others call the long game. He's 65 years old. He's been Chief Justice for 15 years now. It's quite realistic to imagine him being Chief Justice for another 15, 20, 25 years. And so he wants to protect the institution. Now, that doesn't deny he's still conservative. I'll give you an example. 5 years ago, the Supreme Court held that state laws that prohibit same-sex marriage are unconstitutional. I was convinced that John Roberts would be with the liberals on this. He wants to be on the right side of history, and there's no doubt where history is going. Not only was I wrong in my prediction, he wrote a vehement dissent, and the only dissent he's ever read from the bench was in that case. So there are instances where I think his ideology outweighs everything else. And I think in some issues, like abortion, affirmative action, gay and lesbian rights, it's a mistake to think that John Roberts is going to join the liberals. But I agree with your overall characterization that I think he's very concerned about the future of the court and its institutional integrity and legitimacy.
So I'll ask you to forgive me for asking a sort of talk show final set of questions, but I so respect your vision of American democracy and the place of law in that. So, Erwin, what gives you hope in American democracy, and what worries you in American democracy?
Well, thank you for all the sweet words you said. What gives me hope is looking to the past. Over the course of American history, there's been tremendous advances in equality and freedom. We have so far to go with regard to race, but think of how far we've come, not just since 1787 or 1865, but in your and my lifetime. When I was born, there was still laws that required segregation in so much of the country. There's still an enormous way to go with regard to gender equality, but think of how much progress is made in our lifetime. Or take gay and lesbian rights. I just said it just 5 years ago that all the laws prohibiting same-sex marriage were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. We can say the same thing with regard to freedom. There's far more protection of liberty now than when we were born or early in American history. So I really believe in the words of Martin Luther King, where he said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. And so this is a very bleak moment, but I believe that overall in the future, there will be advances in liberty and equality. What gives me pause is we've never had a more authoritarian president than we do right now. And it's clear that about a third of the country would be ready to follow him to no matter what. No form of government lasts forever. And there's no reason to believe that American democracy will last forever. And we look at progressive countries that ultimately became authoritarian. And it really frightens me to see those kind of authoritarian impulses in the United States.
What's ironic, though, is that at least from my reading of history, is that progressive countries turned authoritarian under the pressure of economic depression, of economic stress, and this seems to be happening at a moment of economic prosperity, at least for many Americans, perhaps not for everyone. And that's what it's sort of ironic that this is the turn of the country.
Two things. One is we have more unemployment at any time since the Great Depression. And I don't know that that's going to be getting better anytime soon. Second, we have enormous wealth inequalities that often are parallel color lines. And those two things, very high unemployment and wealth inequality, can create the conditions for instability in a society.
That's very true. So for last question, the President Trump doesn't take advice from anybody. But let's for a moment just imagine what would happen if if a President Biden were inaugurated in January, and he phones up the dean of the law school at UC Berkeley and says, Professor, tell me the first thing I should do in the 100 days to bolster and protect American democracy and to address the unease at the heart of American citizenry. What is Professor Chemerinsky going to tell him?
The president has the bully pulpit. What you know for your congregation, what I know from my law school, is the messages we express can be important for our community. And I hope that Joe Biden, through the campaign, and if he's elected on January 20th, will say he's going to be the unity president, that he's going to create a cabinet that's not only diverse in terms of race and sex, but also have prominent Republicans in it. We are so polarized as a society. We need a president now to bring us together. I think that the Democrats should be planning 100 days of legislation to undo some of the worst things of the Trump administration. The Trump rollbacks with regard to the environment really jeopardize our planet. The Trump rollbacks with regard to labor protections hurt workers all over the country. The Trump actions with regard to immigration break families and are cruel without protecting the country. What I'd like to see Biden do is come in the first 100 days, have a series of legislative proposals and executive reforms to undo the worst of the Trump administration, and to do so all in the name of protecting liberty and equality.
That's great advice. Let's hope. Let's see what it comes to be. Erwin, thank you so very, very much for your time. And we wish you great success in your teaching and in your research and your scholarship and in your leadership of the legal community. And thank you for being with us this evening. Wish you and your family well. Take good care during this time.
Thank you. You too. You're so kind to have me on, and I wish you and your loved ones health and safety, and be well.
Be well.